Let's consider John Wesley's concept of social holiness. It's a phrase that you'll be very familiar with. In fact, it's been quoted so often that it risks losing its buzz. There is no holiness but social holiness. Now, they're frequently misheard words. Some might imagine he means social action, or philanthropy, or civic virtue, social justice. Others hear it in a more general endorsement. Did he mean just fellowship or friendship? Be sociable, that kind of idea. But he's making a much sharper theological claim. In fact, he's addressing a problem, and it's the problem that still haunts us. It's the reduction of salvation to a private transaction and holiness to individual achievement. And so here's the orienting question. What was he addressing? What theological problem was Wesley getting at by insisting that holiness is social? And to answer that, we need to step into the 18th century. The early Methodist revival was marked by intensity, intense experiences of conversion, assurance, and moral awakening. And people spoke of hearts strangely warmed, and they sought pardon and renewal and power over sin. But Wesley immediately realized that individual religious experience left unattended sort of turns into a gated community, a bubble of complacency, or it flared into a crazy fanaticism, enthusiasm without any discipline. Personal piety severed from shared structure drifted. And he saw the danger of what he called solitary religion. And so he constructed something remarkably practical, the class meeting. And the class meeting was not an optional Bible study group. It wasn't just for the spiritually keen. It was the base unit of Methodist life. Remember, they didn't have church buildings. They weren't encouraged to meet on Sundays, but to go to the local parish church. So their real growth happened right here. And every member of a Methodist society belonged to a class of roughly 12 people. They met weekly. They gathered under the leadership of a class leader, not necessarily an ordained leader, often a layperson whose task was not to lecture them or to entertain them, but to focus the conversation on one question: how does your soul prosper? And in those meetings, the members confessed sin and they named temptation. They described victories and failures. Then they prayed for one another and they received counsel and exhortation. And they were asked about very simple things, concrete things. Um, are you attending worship? Are you doing good to the people around you? Are you praying every day? How do you use your money? Holiness was being tracked. Now, this is crucial. For Wesley, sanctification was not a vague aspiration. Every day and every way, I'm getting better and better. It was observable transformation within an accountable community. People that noticed. It's kind of like village life. You can't get away from people knowing what you're doing. Now, alongside the class meetings were bands, and they were even smaller, more intimate groups, often divided by gender or marital status. And bands required deeper confession and vulnerability. You opened yourselves up. And where the class meeting focused on encouragement and general accountability and discipleship, we're in this together, guys. The band went more theologically sharper, moving towards inward sin and subtleties of pride and self-deception, naming names. And beyond the weekly structures were early Methodist field gatherings and later camp meetings. And they were the same thing writ large, spaces of intensified proclamation and communal renewal. They weren't spiritual spectacles detached from discipline. They fed people back into accountable structures. And all of this embodied a conviction that holiness is relationally cultivated rather than privately achieved. Shared sanctification, shared holiness. We are in this together. We really do need one another. Now, Wesley's not denying the necessity of personal faith. He insisted on it, but he rejected the idea that one could pursue sanctification alone because sin distorts perception. We rationalize, we tend to excuse ourselves, and we reinterpret our failures as minor lapses. And without other people, we become unreliable narrators of our own soul's narrative. And so Wesley's answer was structural. Social holiness means that grace works through accountable networks. It means that spiritual growth requires conversation and correction and encouragement and shared practice. It meant that the means of grace are not merely private devotions, but communal disciplines. In short, he's providing a kind of architecture for spiritual discipline. So let's return to the key question. What theological problem was Wesley addressing? And start to think how this applies to us. He was confronting what you might call a truncated soteriology, one that's imagining salvation as an isolated moment. I got saved, but rather than a sustained participation in divine love. And he was resisting an ecclesiology that reduced church to preaching attendance. Remember, they're still paying rent on a pew. It's still very performative, very much ecclesiastical in the sense of priest and people, and almost never the twain shall meet. He was challenging also the Enlightenment drift towards the autonomous self as the primary religious unit. Me in my small corner. And for Wesley, church was not a crowd gathered around a sermon. It was a network of interwoven lives. If justification restores us to God, sanctification, listen to this. This is the crucial point. Sanctification restores us to each other. It creates community. And so holiness, understood as love perfected, cannot remain private. Love, by definition, requires an object. It requires a neighbor. It requires friction. And the class meeting institutionalized that friction. So this is a challenge to our assumptions. So think about it. Think about how radical this is, how radical it still is. Many of our contemporary assumptions about spiritual formation are deeply individualistic. We speak about my quiet time, my devotional life, my growth journey, or whatever. Even when we attend church, we often function as religious consumers rather than as accountable participants. And in many contexts, membership means very little more than assent and attendance. We rarely expect one another to narrate moral struggle. In some contexts, it might even be seen embarrassing or difficult, tricky. We hesitate to ask probing questions. We fear being intrusive. How is your marriage? But Wesley would likely see in this a structural weakness. So here's an interactive prompt for reflection. Very simply, how do Wesley's class meetings challenge our default assumptions about spiritual formation today? Do we assume that growth happens primarily through information transfer rather than relational exposure? Do we equate maturity with independence rather than interdependence? Do we treat vulnerability as optional rather than essential. Wesley's system assumes the exact opposite. It assumes that sanctification requires deliberate space for confession, that exhortation is not control, but care, loving care, that leadership is nothing to do with domination, but is to do with attentive accompaniment. So we want to move towards both praxis and reflection. So think, how does this apply? Just identify in your own context, church or ministry or college, one practice that you do that functions like a class meeting. It might not be explicitly spiritual, might be a supervision group or a research conference, a pastoral cluster, churches together, a covenant group, prayer partners. What matters is that it includes regular gathering, honesty and transparency, an honest reporting of progress and difficulty, a shared responsibility for growth, and a structure that makes perseverance visible. Can you see what's going on? What makes it effective? Does it embody social holiness? And second, think of something that fails to function this way. Perhaps a large gathering with minimal interaction, perhaps a committee structure that avoids accountability, maybe a small group that prioritizes comfort over transformation. So where does your context lack architecture for holiness? Wesley's insight was not merely devotional, but organizational. If we believe holiness is social, we belong together, we must design communities that make social sanctification possible. Now, it doesn't mean replicating the 18th century model. It means recovering their theological logic and asking the question, what might that look like today? Covenant groups, structured mentoring relationships, departmental cultures, chaplaincy, caring for co-pastoring, pastoral support. We're not talking about nostalgia or even history now. We're talking about intentional, spiritual, communal transformation. Holiness flourishes where it is expected, where it is named, and where it is supported. So let's end where we begin. Wesley's statement: there is no holiness but social holiness. It's not about activism, it's not a slogan, it's a ecclesiological claim about how grace grows. And it insists that sanctification is not a solitary climb, but a shared pilgrimage. And the class meeting was Wesley's answer to a theological crisis: how to prevent the revival from collapsing into individualism, how to sustain grace beyond the moment of awakening, and how to ensure that love becomes habit. So we have to ask ourselves these questions. Where am I really known? Whoever asks me about the state of my soul, and in what structure is my spiritual growth made accountable? And how can I help others to persevere in love? Where does that happen? And to recover social holiness is not to diminish personal devotion, it's to embed it in community. It's to confess that we cannot see ourselves clearly without the mirror of another believer. It's to trust that God perfects love not in isolation. You can't be. It's mutual. Relationship means people, right? In the God perfects love in the ordinary, disciplined, sometimes uncomfortable, all times uncomfortable proximity of shared life. And holiness for Wesley was not an individual possession, it was a communal vocation. And so the question is not whether we admire that vision. The question is whether we're willing to build for it. Okay, let's stop there. And I look forward to your questions.